All right, everyone, welcome back to the Asians Represent podcast, the Any award-winning show that explores Asian representation in games media and beyond. My name is Daniel, and I'm joined by one of my amazing co-hosts, Jeremy, for the first episode of our sixth season of the show. For this episode, we're going to be reviewing the Goblin Slayer TRPG, based on the Goblin Slayer light novels written by Kumo Kagyu and illustrated by Noboru Kannatsuki. This game is published in 2019 and was designed by Tadaaki Kawahito with Group SNE, a Japanese company most famous in the gaming world for Record of Lodoss War and the Sword World RPG that we kind of explored on episode 83 of the podcast. Um, awesome. Now, before we dive into it, we have some updates. And I know, Jeremy, you've got a big update, actually, of what's going on in your sort of gaming career.
Yeah, I have a lot of stuff going on at the moment, honestly, but the biggest thing is the game that I've been working on for almost a year at this point, ever since I moved to the UK. Mappa Mundi, its subtitle is an Exploration and Ecology RPG, an EERPG. It is out in pre-release form, so that's our version of a playtest. I've been working on it with my friend George Bickers, who is also a friend of Daniel's at Three Sail Studios, which is a really small three-man company here in the UK, which I am now a member of. And George reached out to me asking if I wanted to collaborate on this game when I moved over here, and I jumped in, and it's a really cool game. I think anyone listening to this podcast might appreciate it. It's sort of like a reverse Monster Hunter, where you go out into the wild and you observe monsters and study them like a biologist instead of fighting them. You chart the world, you draw maps, you use very narrative-focused skills to traverse the wilderness, and we have these really cool tarot card-style decks that unfold based on the decisions that you make over the course of gameplay and influence what kind of obstacles that you encounter during your journeys. So it's been a lot of work, but it's looking really good. It's been coming together bit by bit, and quite proud of the work that we've done. So I urge everyone who's interested in anything that I just said to go to. I think the URL is actually mapamundyrpg.com. I think we have that, but if that doesn't work, you can just go to threesailstudios.com. That's three sales, like a boat, SAILS, studios, STUDIOS.com, and then you can see the promo materials for the game are up there. There's some really awesome art made by our artist, Joel, and it's just like so evocative of kind of that feeling from like Zelda Breath of the Wild, where there's like Link standing on a mountaintop looking at the wide world and just waiting to explore it. And that's kind of the feeling that we were going for with this game. So I'll probably be talking about this a lot more on the podcast because I know Daniel is a big supporter. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, I got you. I got you.
I know. Yeah, I know. Everyone at Asians Represent has also been very supportive of the game. So it's an exciting time. I'll be at the UK Games Expo at the end of this month, running games for it. Join our Three Sail Studios Discord server if you can. The link is on our website, and we'll be running games in there eventually at some point as well. So yeah,
Heck yeah.
my life has been very busy with all of the work that goes into producing an indie RPG, which is immense, like truly immense. And you know, every day I look at George and like the energy that he has to keep a little company running, and I'm amazed.
Yeah, that guy has so much passion. I know you and
He
I
has a
both
he has a he has a
so
lot of
much.
passion. Like his candle does not seem to burn out, and I really respect him for that because my candle burns out all the time.
Yes, I see. I think George and I have a lot in common when it comes to that. He was sending me a lot of the Mapamundi art before it was released, and there was this one piece, and it was like this giant snail, and
Yeah, that's the snail that I
oh
run
my
an adventure
god,
for.
I
Yeah, I
remember
run an
seeing
adventure
it and
for.
being like, I'd buy this game solely because of this one piece of art. And then he told me what
Yeah,
it was about, and I was like, oh, I'm in. And I've actually been bugging George. I was like, yo, you got to tell Jeremy that Jeremy's got to do a thing on Asians Rep on
yeah.
Mapamundi.
I need to do either like a actual play or we need to do something where I run the adventure.
Yeah, we'll
because
we'll
it's
do
a
the adventure. We could do a breakdown of like how the game works and everything. But I'm just like I'm super into it,
I mean,
and
it's a solid like 4 hour intro adventure that has all the themes of the game contained within. And yes, there is a giant snail. I guess it's kind of a spoiler, but at the same time, I mean, it's the art is
it's so good.
plain and visible for everyone to see who gets the pre-release. So there's a giant snail there.
Yeah,
We got some really cool monsters. The world is inspired by like old medieval maps, Mappa Mundi, obviously, but the starting region vaguely inspired by France, and we have this gigantic snail monster, one of the first of several monsters you'll run across, and it's an interesting game because like you can't die. Your characters don't need to worry about death. There is no combat per se, but there are encounters with monsters where your job is not to fight them. Your job is to study them. What can you determine from them as as an observer, as a chronicler? How can you reveal their behaviors? And so we have like a behavior web that kind of represents everything that you can discover, and you can still screw up in the situation. Like the monster can attack you, but you have to react defensively. But it's like behavioral web can be severed and you'll never get a chance to see those behaviors again, which is the entire point of an encounter. So it's very different from like D&D, where your only option is to kill things. Here is you want to study things. And I think you really like it,
oh
Daniel, as an
yeah.
archaeologist, because it's a completely different take on monster quote unquote combat. It's not combat. It is like an entirely new way of acting in the field, at least when it comes to tabletop RPGs.
I mean, like, I feel like every single episode of No Dice No Problem, I always talk about like a cool animal that could inspire a monster, and I feel like Mapamundi is just like the perfect game for me because
Yeah,
I
we
just
got a lot of good stuff.
I love animals. But anyways, we're so excited. I'm super excited for you, Jeremy and
We
George.
got
Like,
our we
oh,
got our own version of the Tarrasque. I gotta tell you that, Daniel, and it looks so much better than the
oh,
D&D Tarrasque
you
in
gotta
my
send me
opinion.
that. You gotta send me that.
It looks so good. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff coming, and we have like our our China area, which I'll be writing and developing the lore for, and there's some Chinese inspired creatures there. So yeah, it'll be a good time.
Oh, that's dope. Well, I'm gonna put all of the links in the show notes because I think this episode might come out after you get back from UK Games Expo.
Yeah,
Um,
UK Games Expo's end of May, so whenever you're listening to this, probably
Probably
beyond the end
June.
of May, probably June. Yeah.
Yeah, probably June. So I'll have all the links to Mapamundi, Three Sales Studios, and all of that incredible stuff in the show notes. Now that said, there is a game where you can die, and there is combat, and it's Goblin Slayer.
Indeed.
So before we dive into it, we have to, for those of you who are unaware of what Goblin Slayer is, we have to preface this episode with a bit of a content warning. The Goblin Slayer franchise depicts dark violence, graphic sexual assault, and misogyny. And it's worth noting because there was, when Goblin Slayer first came out, especially in the West, there was a lot of controversy around it. And so if you find that by the end of the episode you are curious about Goblin Slayer, we wanted to let you know ahead of time. Now, that said, what is Goblin Slayer? What is it about? So, as I said in the introduction, Goblin Slayer is this like big media franchise. Started with a series of light novels. There's a manga. There's several manga series. There's an anime, and there happens to be a tabletop RPG. Now, what is Goblin Slayer about? So, at the main story, the official synopsis actually from the first light novel is as such: a young priestess has formed her first adventuring party, but almost immediately they find themselves in distress. It's the Goblin Slayer who comes to their rescue, a man who's dedicated his life to the extermination of all goblins by any means necessary. And when rumors of his feats begin to circulate, there's no telling who might come calling next. Um, Seems really straightforward. It's a dude who just loves murdering goblins in what is essentially this like JRPG high fantasy world. Jeremy
It's
and
a
I.
set.
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's essentially. Um, I'd say more than a JRPG fantasy world. It's essentially a meta take on like
It's meta
a,
game. I was gonna.
a world that's basically D&D. Like it's basically an AD&D world. Um, based off of the creator's Dungeons and Dragons adventures, and that becomes very apparent if you read it or watch it or consume it in any fashion.
I think
You
it's
know, the
pretty.
character.
I think they're really clear about it. I was gonna save it for later, but we could talk about it now.
No, I mean, I think it's good to just get it out in the
We'll get
open
it.
because
Yeah,
it is, they call it the four-cornered world, and it's basically the world is a gigantic game board, and the gods are rolling their dice.
yeah. They're playing.
Um,
They're playing a game of D&D, and
yeah,
humanity and everyone is involved in the game.
yeah, and Goblin Slayer is the equivalent of like a min-maxed 3.5 like fighter rogue who is only leveled up by killing goblins. Because he has this traumatic backstory involving goblins, having killed his family and abused his sister and stuff like that. So his life is just killing goblins, and the story is what happens when he meets some other adventurers that kind of help him move beyond that. Like he gets a party. The formerly solo adventurer learns that there's more to adventuring than just killing goblins. That kind of what is what the story is in a nutshell.
Hmm.
And there's some interesting things there. Like I know you're reading the manga right now, Daniel, and you're up to like chapter 16. You said.
Yes.
I've read all the manga, like all the manga that's released. I actually haven't watched the anime because I don't have that much time for watching anime, but I've read all the manga. Um, Goblin Slayer Year One, Goblin Slayer Brand New Day, I think,
There's
or
there's Goblin Slayer Daikatana.
Goblin Slayer Daikatana, which is the story
Yeah.
of like this other party that fought the Demon King, which I actually did not like as much. I thought I was gonna like it, but I didn't like it as much. But yeah, I've read all the manga, and there is like an interesting ongoing theme there of you are more than your trauma because the Goblin Slayer titular character and like the priestess, they both have traumatic experiences involving goblins, and they slowly move on from that the more and more you read. So there's good stuff in there, but a lot of it is, I think, also masked under the kind of dark violence that we talked about in the content warning, and also the meta narrative of this is really a D&D game, and Goblin Slayer does not abide by the god's dice rolls. He decides his own destiny.
Yeah, it's almost like Goblin Slayer is the one god or one player's the edgelord's character.
The
Uh,
Edgelord's character, he starts out that way, but he does
he starts out
change.
that way. I'm
Like,
starting to get
yeah,
glimpses of that
yeah,
in the manga now. When he's like, I think I want to be an adventurer. I think I want to
yeah.
move beyond this. Um, I I got this vibe with Goblin Slayer. So when I said that you and I were reading this and we were going to do an episode, a whole bunch of people in our Discord server were like, if you watch the anime, you're going to have a really hard time getting past the first episode.
Yeah,
And
I got thoughts on this, but you go first.
and there are going to be things that you will like about Goblin Slayer, but there is always going to be this but statement, and that but
Hmm.
statement is going to be about the goblins
Hmm.
and the sort of graphic nature of how the role in which they play in the world. CJ Lung, who has the Cool History Bros channel and Don't Stop Thinking on YouTube, actually did
Hmm.
a funny video about why the world of Goblin Slayer really fucking sucks, and why
Hmm.
its
Yeah.
economy makes no sense. Um, but I think the thing that there are before we started recording, we were talking about one moment in the story that was like really really cool with the use of a magic item, and it was like so
Uh,
epic that I was like, oh man, I want to
it's a
do
ma-
this
it's a
in.
yeah, it's a magic teleportation scroll, or
Yeah,
a magic scroll that has the teleport spell imbued in it, I believe,
it's like he's got a scroll, and it's a scroll of like a gate scroll is what they called it,
or a gate scroll.
and
Yeah.
typically people use it. It's actually in Delicious in Dungeon, they also use it to like escape the dungeons and stuff.
Hmm.
And this is like a minor spoiler, but instead of using the gate, the target for the gate scroll is not a place of refuge. He basically makes the gate scroll, the other side of it is the bottom of the ocean. So he
Hmm.
fucking uses this scroll to basically cut a monster in half with water pressure.
Yeah, to take out an ogre. Um, when I read that, so I know you feel this way too, Daniel.
Yeah.
Um, when I read that, as someone who GMs a lot but does not get to play, that was like seeing a player come up with an incredibly elegant and creative solution to a problem that I had presented them, and me being like, "You take all the inspiration, take all the
Yeah,
hero points." Like that is so good, dude.
100%.
Like that is how I felt, and I think that is why I actually quite like Goblin Slayer as a franchise, despite its reliance on some of the unfortunate stereotypes of like seinen manga of like dark fantasy. I think it's because there is this meta narrative of, hey, this is a game of D&D, and Goblin Slayer is like an edgelord who kind of evolves beyond that and does some actually very creative things. And I can't blame anyone for noping out of the Goblin Slayer franchise because of the sexual violence involving goblins in the beginning. But I think for someone like me who runs a lot of games, doesn't get to play them, there is a lot to enjoy in this narrative.
I would say that I completely agree. So we'll like elephant in the room. There is this theme of rape in Goblin
Yeah.
Slayer, and
Well,
the
and also bioessentialism
and
because
bioessentialism. Yeah, we're going
the
to talk about
goblins,
that as well.
yeah, the goblins use they kidnap like human any women for breeding purposes. Basically,
Hmm.
it's flat out stated in the first chapter, and there is like a rape scene in the first chapter. Um, and there is also after Goblin Slayer kills all the goblins. Goblin Slayer talks about how all goblins are terrible and should stay in their holes. Then he goes and kills goblin children in the first
Yep.
episode of the anime and I think the manga too.
It's
So
like
there's
yeah,
that right from the gate.
first one or two chapters he does
Yeah.
that. There are lines that are super edgy when he's like, "Oh God," he always says how goblins have an excellent sense of smell. And I wrote this down in my notes because I was like, when I was first reading it, and he was like, "Oh, goblins have an excellent sense of smell, especially when it comes to girls who have wet themselves."
Yeah.
And then there was this moment in chapter 12 of the manga, and it was really vile, where goblins use meat shields.
Yes, and
Um,
they're
and
human corpses.
they are living humans. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, the goblins in the world of Goblin Slayer are depicted as extremely vile. There is this theme of bioessentialism when it comes to goblins, and they also rely on the tropes of like, the elves are snooty and look down on the
Yeah.
dwarves, and it's constantly
Although the main dwarf character is Asian, I will say
yes,
that
yes,
he is
yes.
he is
I
a
do like
dwarf
that.
shaman. He's a dwarf shaman wearing like little clogs, and he's the type of dwarf who would eat the hot pot that we keep talking about, which
Oh,
is what dwarves eat.
100%. But yeah, that there is a lot to like in Goblin Slayer, and the ogre battle actually is what made me want to stick it through. And I'm like, okay,
It's
I'm in.
it's definitely a turning point. I think it kind of gets better from there. I will say this: the reliance on sexual violence almost not completely, but really starts going away after the beginning. I mean, the more you read of the manga, the less they show goblins doing those things, and it's the same for all of the Goblin Slayer Year One as well. They do the usual like, okay, these goblins are terrible, they're raping women thing in the beginning, but then as the series goes on, it's almost like they mainly use that stuff for shock value in the beginning,
Yeah.
and then kind of realize that they don't have to rely on that as much. And I think this is kind of a problem that I have with a lot of dark fantasy seinen manga and anime, in that there is this reliance on these sexual violence tropes and these bioessentialist tropes. It's a problem in a lot of good series, ongoing series. I mean, you could even say like Berserk does
I
it
was
too
gonna
to
say,
some
what are your
extent.
thoughts on Berserk? Because Berserk's got this. I
Berserk
think the
does it too.
world of Berserk is way better than the world of Goblin Slayer.
Absolutely,
Um,
but Berserk is not as much of a meta thing as Goblin
Very
Slayer is.
true,
That's
and
how
I
Goblin Slayer gets away with it. It's a meta narrative.
definitely.
My thinking is that Berserk has some of the same issues, like a lot of series. Berserk, not even fantasy, like Gogol 13, Lupin the Third.
Oh
Lupin the
yeah.
Third, the original manga, is super rapey. It's actually really disturbing to read. Um, but there's a lot of these tropes that I think Goblin Slayer falls into in the very beginning, and then as the series went on, it's almost like the author realized he didn't need to rely on that stuff as much. And I don't know if it comes across as much in the original light novels, which I have not read, but because
Neither
the
have I.
original light novels, a lot more is left to the reader's imagination. You don't have these kind of depictions of like naked bodies with goblins surrounding them that you have in the anime and the manga. And so I think there is kind of an issue in the depiction here, in that yes, you're having a sexual violence scene, but a lot of the women are disrobed, and they're in poses that are meant to be sexy. That's the problem. It is
Mhm.
sexual violence that is sort of drawn and depicted in a way that is meant to be titillating to the viewer, and that's the problem, and that is the problem in a lot of manga and anime aimed towards men, unfortunately.
Yeah,
So Goblin
absolutely.
Slayer falls victim to that trope, and I think honestly, the story does not need that. Um, they don't, even if they wanted to still maintain the fact that goblins are vicious and use humans for breeding, they don't need to depict it visually in the way that they do in the manga and anime. And as the series goes on, they move away from that, which I'm glad for. But I do think that stuff in the beginning is tough to get through, and
It,
I respect anyone who drops the series because of that.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I'm getting to the point where it's they're definitely moving away from it, but it is definitely a an obstacle to get over, and one that for many is not even worth approaching to begin with.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but that said, a lot of those themes do not make their way into the TRPG.
In
So
fact, they have a content warning in the
they
TRPG
do.
saying you should not expect your players to be down with, they call them erotic scenes and graphic violence, I believe, in the game. So
Yeah,
it's interesting. This
and
this
they're
is this
aware
is
of it.
this yeah, this does not have like lines and veils like how we might have in
Hmm.
an RPG produced today for an English speaking audience. There's no content warnings and stuff like that, but there is a little box of advice saying that you do not need to necessarily stick to the quote unquote grotesque depictions and erotic scenes that are sometimes prevalent in the original work.
So before we talk about what we liked, what we didn't like with this book, we'll give you folks a quick overview. So first of all, why did we decide to review the Goblin Slayer TRPG? We say TRPG and not TTRPG because TRPG is the sort of Japanese convention when talking about tabletop RPGs. Tabletop is one word. So we originally chose the Goblin Slayer game because this is actually the only way to get an official English language hack of Sword World. Sword World, which is also published by Group SNE, does not have an official English translation. So if you want to actually have a physical Sword World book that you can reference, Goblin Slayer in English is actually the only way you can get it. Now, in episode 83 of the podcast, we did talk about how there is this very extensive translation effort. So it kind of renders our reasoning moot. And I think Goblin Slayer is an interesting topic of conversation. So the book itself, like physically, so the book is 615 pages of content.
It's fat.
Um, it's
It's a
it's
big
a
fat book.
thick book, but I did the math. 65% of the book is dedicated to world building, reference tables, or like monsters and skills and spells, and adventure content. So
Yeah.
there are actually 95 pages of world building. There are 251 pages of just reference. So whether it be like listing out all the skills, the spells, the checks, the monsters, and then there is 56 pages of adventure content. The rest of it, so the remaining 35%, is actually like rules and mechanics and stuff like that. So don't think that this extremely thick book is going to be all rules. If you're a fan of Goblin Slayer, you're going to get a lot out of this. This is essentially like a show Bible or an IP Bible for Goblin Slayer because it has everything about the Four Cornered World in it.
Although it was missing a few things. I do have some qualms
Oh, what
with
was missing?
its I wanted stats for the characters. I
Oh,
wanted
the main
stats for
characters,
Goblin.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted stats for Goblin Slayer, Priestess. The Lizard Priest, like the characters that I like, and they don't give you that. They don't even give you like a bio for Goblin Slayer, which pissed me off. They give
I
you a
didn't even
bio
think
for
about that.
yeah, they give you a bio for some of the other generic characters in the Goblin Slayer universe. Like there's this hero character that is sort of your happy-go-lucky JRPG female protagonist, and she's listed in here, but not Goblin Slayer himself. So that kind of pissed me off.
I
But
didn't even think about that because I
yeah,
was I was looking and I was like, oh, this spell is the spell that priestess uses. Like I'm like, oh, minor heal. That's the spell she
the
uses.
spells are cool. I do like the spells, but I did have some issues with the fact that there were no stat blocks or even like example character sheets for the main characters in the world or descriptions of them. And
That's a
so I
good
do
point.
think that is a little bit lacking. But there is a lot of information on the world in general. There's some information on the races in Goblin Slayer. Um, and I think it does a pretty good job of serving up lore for the Goblin Slayer world. Even though honestly, the Goblin Slayer world is very generic, and it's meant to be that way
Super
because
generic.
it is a meta D&D narrative. Like that's all it is, and it helps if you know that going in. Like this is a generic world, and it's not meant to be not generic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight because if you go in and you're like, yo, this fucking like fantasy world makes no sense. Yeah, but if you approach it from the context of like the DM is trying to flesh out a world with a ton of detail at the request of the players, there
Yeah.
are going to be plot holes and
Yeah,
things
I
aren't
don't,
going to
don't,
make
don't yeah,
sense.
don't expect it to make sense. Like honestly, some of the original lore for Goblin Slayer was this might be an urban legend, but I think some of it was developed by like a bunch of people on a message board like 4chan just talking shit. And so
Okay.
that's what honestly you should expect. It's not about the lore of the world. It's about how Goblin Slayer and his companions solve problems on their adventures creatively, like the aforementioned example of the gate scroll we talked about. That is entertaining.
I think the thing about the Goblin Slayer manga that I've really liked so far is how much their actions rely on their knowledge of the creatures or the things that they're fighting. It's like
Yes.
they were entering this temple, and the dwarf, the Asian dwarf, in their party is like, whoa, hold up, that's going to be a trap. Look, the stone is
Yes.
brand new compared to everything else. Or Goblin Slayer's like, yeah, I
Yes.
know
Exactly.
goblins usually do this. It's like
See, for
it's
a
not like
GM, it is
metagaming.
very
It's
for a GM is that's very entertaining to read. I mean, maybe to other
yes.
people it won't be, but I know you and me are like reading that and feeling the same things, being like, oh shit, like this is how I got to use some ideas here for my next dungeon
Well,
crawl.
the
Like,
characters straight up have conversations that you would have if you're playing a game. It's like, okay, we should go in and we should do this. But then
hmm
when this happens, I'll use this ability. Or like,
exactly.
oh, I know that goblins don't do this during the day. So now is the right time to strike. It's almost as if somebody had read through the monster manual, knew everything about goblins, and then was playing a game as a character who could use that meta knowledge. Um, and none of that really comes out in the game itself because, from a mechanical perspective, this is very much 90% of it is Sword World 2.5.
Yeah. So I mean, this
So,
is
yeah.
interesting because as I mentioned to you before we started this, I skimmed Sword World. You actually read through the translations and stuff. I
Yes.
liked your analysis of Sword World 2.5, and I liked what I skimmed of Sword World 2.5. But I'd be keen on hearing how close this is because I do feel like this is missing a few bits here and there in terms of combat. Like, there's no official like frontline and backline language in here when talking about
Yeah.
in
So,
terms
I
of
actually think
fighters and
that
combat.
the Goblin Slayer TRPG does things better than Sword World. So,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
okay, so let's start from character creation. So let's do it the same way I broke down Sword World. So we'll do character creation and then we'll do like mechanics. So character creation, this has a lot. There's not a lot as much content. Now, there is a good reason why Sword World has so much more, and that's because Sword World has been around for significantly longer. So Sword World has all of the Lodoss content. So I mean, Sword World's been around since the 80s. So they just have the benefit of all of this fiction that they can rely on. So in Sword World, the core game is made up of 3 books, each just under 500 pages long. Goblin Slayer is just 1 book. So in Sword World, there are basically, I think, 11 character races or ancestries. In Goblin Slayer, there are, how many are there? I think there are
There are,
5. There's human, dwarf,
yeah,
elf, lizardman, and Rhea, which is
halfling.
halfling. So yeah, there are 5. So first difference there. The second difference is actually in the attributes. So in Sword World, the attributes are like Dex. They actually have Dex and agility. There's strength, vitality, intelligence, and spirit. In Goblin Slayer, characters have 12 attributes, but these 12 attributes are made up of 4 primary abilities. So strength, psyche, technique, and intelligence, and then 3 secondary ones. So focus, endurance, and reflex. And to get 12, you basically have your strength focus. And they basically like interface like Mendelian
Yeah,
genetics.
like intelligence, endurance,
Yeah,
psych reflex, technique, focus. It's interesting.
it makes for nuance in a way that makes a lot of sense in a Japanese tabletop RPG because
hmm
both Sword World and Goblin Slayer are written in a way that Western readers may feel over explains everything to them. If you have
Yeah,
never played a tabletop RPG, you can pick up Goblin Slayer and know how to play the game perfectly.
That is one thing that I do like about this big 600-page book. It is a complete game. It includes 2 adventures in the back. It includes all the monsters you need. It includes advice for the GM, advice for the players. Like, it's everything you need in one book, which is why it's so fat. And the 3-book split of like D&D and even Sword World 2.5, it's fine. It has its merits. It certainly is easier from a printing perspective, but it is nice to just have like a 1-book RPG that you
Yeah,
can just break out.
absolutely. And so, like, apart from, the attribute system, there is a lot in common. The biggest deviations I've noticed are actually in some of the sort of secondary mechanics. So Sword World does not have this sort of wound, attrition, and fatigue mechanic that Goblin Slayer does, and
Yeah, that was
that's for a
interesting.
good reason, because I think that the system that Goblin Slayer has is a really good example of how the mechanics of the game have interfaced with what is expected of Goblin Slayer fiction.
Hmm.
And we could talk about that a little later. So that differs. Combat in Goblin Slayer is actually a lot more streamlined than in Sword World. So the noticeable difference you mentioned was like they don't have the different front lines. So they don't have like the allied rear guard and the enemy rear guard and like
So I
the
actually
front
really like
line.
that. I was kind of
It's very
I was kind of
JRPG.
Yeah, I was kind of bummed that they didn't have that, especially because in Goblin Slayer, people are constantly saying we need fighters on the front line, we need fighters on like the back line. So you haven't read or watched Goblin Slayer season 2, but
No.
which has stuff from Goblin Slayer Daikatana, the spin-off Gaiden series, but that's all about like a dungeon crawl. And they're constantly talking about like frontline fighters, backline support. Like it's just constant language that they use, and I was a bit bummed they didn't have it in
I
here.
think the removal of that though makes for slightly more nuanced combat in Goblin Slayer. So there are
Mm.
things that you aren't going to see in Sword World. So Goblin Slayer kind of gets rid of that. When combat starts, you do the same thing as in Sword World, as you basically set up the scene. Where are people? The game actually has this thing called encounter distance. So they basically set up the bounds of the encounter. So if you are, say, like the fighter type character, which is like, I mean, you could be any number of fighter classes, but let's say you're like the fighter, and you're like, I'm going to be up front because I'm a melee person. You actually start at a distance actually determined by the GM, unless it's like a surprise and whatnot. Then there is a rule that says all of your sort of rear support characters have to be within 5 meters behind anybody who declares himself to be in the front. Then movement is very much like D&D. You have like a movement speed, and you can
Hmm.
move around the sort of encounter area. Whereas in Sword World, you're basically moving between these 3 combat areas.
Yeah, they don't have advice for using minis in here. They
No,
kind of
they
give you
don't.
theater of the mind, but they do tell you to pull out scratch paper and draw stuff. And they've got some diagrams in the book that honestly look like trigonometry. Like it's very
I know
mathematical.
exactly
Wait,
what you're talking about. It's the if you're trying to move through people or around people, they have these like
yeah,
circles that they
that's a
drew.
circle. That is some Gary Gygax shit right there. Like that is. I mean, which makes sense because on page 12 in the little introduction, they talk about how some of the characters in the game, or rather the world, sometimes curse Gygax when they're when they're having problems in a fight, and so it's meta and it's fine. But I actually think minis would probably help the combat here. It's not like grid based like how Pathfinder and D&D are, but they might help for
Yeah, they
knowing where
refer
things
to
are.
everything in meters, and they expect you to
Yeah.
kind of theater of mind it, or
Yeah,
they do
I'm
say
not
roughly
Asian
measure
enough
it.
to be able to I'm not Asian enough to be able to do meters in my head with theater of the mind. So
But the tables that Jeremy and I are talking about are referred to as movement obstruction. So if you're trying to
yeah.
move around people, they basically have a check to see if you could basically push back someone or if you could push someone back into their original position.
Hmm.
In Sword World and Goblin Slayer, there is basically a rule for everything. And by that, I mean a check for everything.
Hmm. Yes.
So the thing that they share in common is that they're both 2d6 games. So in Sword World and in Goblin Slayer, you roll 2d6, and then you have a whole bunch of bonuses. Typically, they're related to like a skill, your class level. Class level is super important in both games, and some other context.
Hmm.
I think that another thing they have in common is that there is a lot of build variety in both games. In that when you make your character after you pick your race, you essentially get to pick all of these narrative components of them, like your history, your background, and stuff like that. And then you get a bunch of XP that you get to spend, and this XP can basically be spent on certain classes. So if you want, you could basically build a character in a way where you start with 4 classes. Um, in Sword World, it's a little bit more granular in that they have what are essentially like major and minor classes. Goblin Slayer doesn't have that at all because, again, the world of Goblin Slayer is kind of limited to fighter, monk, ranger, scout, sorcerer, priest, dragon priest, and shaman, and that's
Yeah.
it.
You are definitely encouraged to multi-class, though. It is
For sure.
it is a multi-class friendly game, and which I don't know if that's a commonality in a lot of Japanese TRPGs, but I've been playing Fabula Ultima as well, which
Oh
is
yeah.
the Japanese TRPG-inspired RPG made by Italians, which is actually way better than I thought it would be, and very good. And in that one, you start at level 5, and multi-classing is expected as well. So
I do
I
like
don't
how
know.
you everybody can roll initiative in Goblin Slayer. In Sword World, it's something that I found pretty
Yeah.
peculiar. You had to be, I think, a scout or a ranger to be able to even roll initiative in the first place. But in this game, it's
Yeah.
definitely more like Western RPGs.
So it's interesting. I think, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but after having read your take on Sword World and after having read this, so it is very fascinating to me to see like the AD&D DNA in Sword World, but also changed and evolved on like a separate path than what we see now in English-speaking countries like America or the UK, where it's like I think there's a lot of influence from Tunnels and Trolls, honestly, because
Oh, 100%.
that was really popular in Japan, and probably RuneQuest as well. And so you have Sword World, a system that it's just different from what we might like the direction TRPGs or TTRPGs are moving in the West, where there's still these kind of crunchy, modular, advanced Dungeons and Dragons style bits and bobs in there, meshed with Tunnels and Trolls, meshed with RuneQuest, and modified through a Japanese lens. And that, to me, was one of the more fascinating things about reading this.
I think that's one of the reasons why if you're interested in game design or you're just interested in getting new perspectives or mechanics, you should definitely look into Sword World and Goblin Slayer.
Yeah.
Um, my assessment of Sword World and Goblin Slayer is that if you were to compare them to modern, like Western tabletop RPGs, they essentially have elements of 4th edition,
Yeah.
powered by the apocalypse,
Mm.
and the Mithras system, which is what RuneQuest 6 is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
I say that because everything that you do in the game is essentially bound by a check, whether it be in combat or it be outside of combat. And that is very similar to how moves work and how moves kind of determine what you are able to do or the narrative triggers behind the mechanics
Hmm.
in powered by the apocalypse systems. Combat, though, is not as tactical as, like 4th edition D&D, but
Yeah,
you have
that's why I
powers.
think more of earlier editions. But yeah, powers, that makes
But you
sense.
have powers. And
Yeah,
then
you have
if
powers.
you add into this D&D, sorry, this D&D, this DNA, like RuneQuest and then AD&D, you
Yeah.
add that sort of granularity to it.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot of people will look at this game and immediately be like, oh, this is a tactical game because it has so many rules. It is not a tactical game.
It's not it is it's a lot of information, but I wouldn't call it tactical. It
Yeah,
just it's
rules
yeah.
don't make a game tactical,
Yeah.
because there is very little room for strategic decision making in Goblin Slayer or Sword World, apart from like modifying your initiative and setting up abilities and stuff like that. But not that's not really tactical. You're not thinking about
Yeah.
positioning as much. There are rules for cover, but because they don't have a system for grid based combat or um, anything like that. It's not very tactical. It's rules heavy. It's very beginner friendly once you read the book and get beyond the rules. It's easy to
Hmm.
learn, for sure because it's very prescriptive, but it's not
Yeah.
tactical.
It's an interesting combination. It's rules heavy, but also but also beginner friendly. It
Hmm.
is not technical, but we can see the lineage of a lot of RPGs that are tactical in this. So, yeah, I think it's kind of a fascinating product. And the other thing that I wanted to mention earlier but forgot, it also, anyone who reads this should know this, it is also very much a translated RPG. I'm not the biggest fan of the English translation of this. It's very literal.
Yes.
Um, you can tell, like, if you study Japanese at all, you can tell what the original Japanese phrases are and how the translator kind of translated word for word, which is fine. They did a decent enough job, but it will feel like tonally it's different if you're used to reading like a typical Western RPG, down to the point where they're talking about places in the GM section. They're talking about places where you could play, and they talk about like doing it at someone's house, doing it in an office, doing it in a karaoke parlor. And I was like, that's cute. That's really cute. Yeah, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go do KTV with my friends. I'm gonna play Goblin Slayer
Play
while
Goblin
like
Slayer.
yeah, while like J-pop tunes blare in the background. Yeah.
Yeah, at one of those KTV lounges or something with the big
Yes.
rooms that
Yes.
you can get.
Yeah.
I I think I really like that they haven't adapted it to like a Western audience because
Yeah. I
they
like
know
that
that the
they've.
people who will buy this
Yeah.
want the Japanese experience.
Yeah, I like to an extent what they've done and how they haven't adapted it, but at the same time, part of me was like, I studied Japanese for a bunch of years, so I'm like, I might have translated this a little differently, or might have spiced this up ever so slightly. But that's probably just like when they call stat blocks data. I'm like the data on monsters. I'm like, that's kind of, but it is what it is. It's an interesting experience to read.
And that's what like Sword World is. And the thing is, this book costs 26 Canadian dollars or 20 US. That's
Hmm.
the
Yeah,
MSRP.
it's way cheaper than your D&Ds
But
basically.
in Japan, I did see this book in Japan. It is effectively the equivalent of like 5 US dollars for this book in
Well,
Japan.
it's Tenkoban size. It's
Yeah.
small. It's
And
like
the
your
paper quality is a
paperback.
lot different.
Yeah. It doesn't
And
have much art,
yes.
which is interesting. It's mostly all text. So this is actually quite an inspiring book from an indie RPG maker's perspective because it's an entire game in a fat book, but also doesn't use that much art. They didn't have to pay for much new art. Some of it's recycled. Um, and the layout is still quite clean and accessible despite that.
I definitely agree. I think the layout is very accessible. I think it flows very well. A lot like whoever like the people who worked on this game clearly have a lot of experience with instructional design because the way in which you read the book, it literally will walk you through character creation and it will tell you why they make certain recommendations. And then they are constantly referencing other pages. So if they're
Yeah.
like, oh, you're going to have to make this check, they will always put the page number for the rules of that check,
Yeah,
which
I
is something
like
that
that.
you're not going to see as much in like your D&Ds or your Pathfinders. Um, now, I want to ask you this, Jeremy.
Hmm.
Um, Mechanically, from like a design perspective, was there something that really stood out to you when it came to this game?
So we talked about this before we started recording, but yes, on page, what was it, 166, 162?
The
Yeah, they have a
fate.
they have a fate point system, and this is sort of like inspiration, I guess, or like hero points or whatever way, whatever you want to call it in games. But it's basically the player can use fate points to increase a check's result. Um, they can also use it to re-roll dice. But the interesting things to me were the other two options. They can use fate points to always flee from a fight. And I really like that because the advice that the book gives the GM is the GM should make up a sudden event of some sort, such as the cavern ceiling falling, blocking off the enemy, or another monster storming in and throwing everything into chaos to explain why the PCs were able to run away. Um, the GM decides how long the new area the players fled to will remain safe. Fleeing only grants a temporary reprieve from danger, and it usually won't last too long. I actually really like this. Um, I like how it gives the players the ability to always escape a dangerous combat. I like the narrative advice for the GM to spice things up. And I think it reminds me of Chrono Cross, a JRPG that also lets you flee from every major battle, including the final boss. I find that to be very player friendly. I found that to be a nice mechanical design decision that also leads to fun narrative, because who doesn't like the idea of like a landslide suddenly occurring in a dungeon and like, okay, yeah, I'm a GM, I got to come up with something. Let's make it fun. Let's go with it.
It's
I just think that I just think that's cool.
it's kind of like in Jurassic Park 3. Have you seen Jurassic Park 3?
Yes, I have seen
Okay, so you know
Jurassic
how
Park
there's
3.
like the Spinosaurus is like the main villain. But
Hmm.
there are scenes when like the T-Rex comes in and then you get the two dinosaurs fighting, and that's very much what a GM would do. It's like, "Oh, there's this monster that's coming in and you're in this big living world. Well, another monster comes in and the two monsters are fighting, giving you the opportunity to escape because they've directed their attention elsewhere."
Yeah, I like that kind of stuff. I think it's fun. You know, I think as a GM, sometimes you might screw up and you might design an encounter that your players can't win because it's too hard, and then you got to pull something out of your ass to keep them from like full party wiping. And it's like, oh, there's an NPC that comes in to help. Or like, oh, well, actually, there something happens. But this kind of is explicit advice telling you that it's okay to do that, and actually giving the power to the players. So it's not just on you to be the one to have to fix things. They can flee when they want to, and I like that.
Yeah, I
Um,
would say that if there was anything you would take out of the Goblin Slayer TTRPG or TRPG, it would be the fate point mechanic. What I think is really neat about this is that
they also let
it,
you get hints for an adventure with a fate point, which I
yes,
think is fun
so
too.
fate points can be used, like you said, to increase the number, like rolls. So increase your total roll, re-roll, flee, or get a hint. Fleeing and getting a hint both don't require you to roll at all. But for increasing the results of a check or to reroll dice, you obviously have to roll dice. What's interesting though is that the game tells you, or tells the GM, that based on the difficulty of the sort of adventure, the number of fate points that you get uh, will like vary. So if it's an easy adventure, the party, and I say party because this is a shared pool, not an
Hmm.
individual one like
Yes.
hero points or inspiration, the party gets 3. For a medium difficulty, it's 5, and for a difficult adventure, it's 7. And so everybody has to agree on the use of a fate point. And once you use a fate point, whether you succeed or not, whether it be to increase the results of a roll or to re-roll something, the number of fate you have increases. And once you hit 12, you can't get any more. And so, did I get that right? Yes, I did get that right. So
Yes. Yes.
you
If
get
there are
more.
12 or more fate points, you cannot use anymore. Correct.
And
Yeah.
then, so if I say want to re-roll dice, I have to actually succeed at a fate roll. And so I roll 2d6 and I have to get higher than the number of fate that I actually have. Um, I think it's super cool, and it's not necessarily bound to any other mechanical system within Goblin Slayer. So you could basically take 2 pages worth of content from this book and bring that into any tabletop RPG. Now, one other thing that I think is really cool about Fate Points is that you actually get experience from using Fate. So at the end of an adventure, the GM is actually encouraged to be like, okay, how many fate points do you currently have in your pool? If you have 7 or less, so that means that if it was an easy adventure and you did not accumulate fate by actually attempting one of these 4 things, you don't get any bonus experience. But if you have like 7 or 9, you get 250 experience points at the end,
Hmm.
which is pretty significant because it takes 1,000 XP to get a level in a class. And so it actually encourages the players to actually run away if they have to, get hints from the GM, or actually like reroll. I actually really like it.
Yeah, I think making it a shared party pool is really fun. It gives a resource that the party can decide upon during these critical moments, and adds to the overall fiction. And I think it's worth stealing. And I wish it's something that more games would have, honestly.
Oh, definitely. Um, Another thing that I really liked was this idea of attrition. So in the core rulebook, they kind of describe it very succinctly on page 45. Um, and from like a meta perspective, it is very much a mechanic that is used to represent the toll
Hmm.
adventuring takes on like a party. So basically, at the end of each round of combat, you have these like check boxes on your character sheet for attrition, and you essentially check them off at the end of a round. And on this track of attrition, there are like 40 points. Um, you essentially have regular sort of like checkboxes and then spiked ones is what the translation says. But they're basically like circles with like that look like the sun. And every time you check off one of those, you can get fatigue. And
Hmm.
fatigue essentially stacks up on a character to the point where you're getting all of these penalties and potentially dying. So if you're in combat for an extended period of time, even if you don't take a ton of damage to kill you, you can die from exhaustion, from just the act of being in combat. So if you're basically going from encounter to encounter to encounter, kind of like through a gauntlet, death is actually kind of inevitable.
Yeah, I think so. I like this in theory. I think this is a section for me where actually I would have appreciated a different visual example because for some reason the check boxes and the little circles, the spike circles, did not compute in my brain, and I had to read this several times to figure out what was going on. Um, because it's yeah, I think it's something that if it were visually represented in a slightly different way, my brain could wrap its could wrap itself around this a little bit more because I definitely like it in theory. As a GM, I'm wondering if I would struggle to remember
It's not something I would
attrition.
use in my own game,
Yeah,
but I think from reading Goblin Slayer, there's literally that point where they defeat the ogre and he wants to go in and kill the rest of the goblins and they're like no you shouldn't, you just got fucked up, we should back
yeah.
off. And they actually mention, hey, you're gonna get so much fatigue. And I was like, oh, that's this mechanic. So I see it, I see the fiction, kind like the Goblin Slayer fiction kind of
I think
in the
it. I think
mechanics
it could.
here.
Yeah, I think it's a decent idea. I would need to see it and like play it myself
Mm-hmm.
to know how well I like it. I'm always back and forth with some of these systems that like, attrition, like encumbrance, like the weight of stuff that you're carrying. I'm always back and forth on whether I actually want them or whether or not in the midst of me running a game, I'm just going to be too much for me to focus on to avoid paying attention to these small things. I think here it makes sense. For me, visually, I would have liked a different depiction of it, but I do appreciate why it's there.
I think the part that makes it complicated is the fact that your character has multiple things that they have to track. So in like,
Yeah,
let's use D&D as a
definitely.
point of reference. You have like your armor class, cool, easy, right? We have your HP. That's it. Awesome. Right? Your HP goes to 0, you start dying. Really simple. In in Goblin Slayer, you have life force, which is not
Mm,
your HP. Life force is basically this like static thing that is always a point of reference in the game mechanically. Then you have wounds. Wounds are basically your HP. Um, so the thing is, when you take damage, you're actually counting up, first of all, with
yeah.
wounds. And you're comparing your wounds whenever you take damage to your life force. So
There's a
when
little
you're,
bit of a Thaco vibe
it's
going on
very
here,
much like
like
a Thaco thing, but
to
also
hit
like
armor class 0.
it's very much like, you know how people joke about character sheets being like spreadsheets? This is
I
where
mean,
it's a
I'm
spreadsheet.
looking at the character. I'm looking at the character sheet now. It's a long little bastard right here.
it's it's long. And so
Got a
like
little, it's got
when your
lots of bits and bobs.
wounds are equal then or greater than your life force, you gain fatigue more easily. So what does that mean? So when you actually gain fatigue, that's from attrition. You
Hmm.
only gain fatigue from attrition if you check off what they call a spiked bubble. But if you have too many wounds, you get fatigue every time you mark attrition and double when you get a spiked bubble.
Yeah.
And then the fatigue is basically what kills your character.
Yeah, this is where we say that the game is rules heavy
It's
in some spots because there's a lot of little thingamabobbers for players to keep track of that like
100%.
a so-called modern game or at least one that is on the Western design sensibility scale probably would do away with.
Yeah, what I would do is because this game in combat, you're not rolling against someone's armor class. What you're actually doing in combat is you're rolling a check. Everything is a check. There's no attack rolls. It's
Yeah,
just
it's all just
an
checks.
attack
Okay.
check or a spell use check. And you are comparing your check to what is essentially an efficiency table. So the higher your roll, the more efficient it is with your damage. And so you can deal bonus damage. And then you're comparing damage to armor. And then armor is what basically negates things. But in this game, you also have opportunities to dodge, block, and parry if you have like shields and shit.
Yeah.
So you can actually avoid damage like fairly easily if you build your character right. So I could see why they have this sort of attrition thing, because attrition is what makes sure you end combat faster, that you don't stall. I think they could have honestly gone with like removing either life force or wounds. If they had removed wounds or something like that and just focus on attrition and fatigue, it might make the game feel a lot deadlier. Because when characters, at least in the beginning of Goblin Slayer, get hurt, they really get hurt. And that's not
Yeah.
represented well in the design of this game.
I mean, I know you like to strip everything back and make it an OSR game, Daniel, but I agree with you here. It could benefit from some of that little OSR hacking and just make it deadlier, because this is a deadly world, and you wanna have grim and gritty violence at the forefront. Then you don't really need all of these different systems like life force, like wounds, like whatever.
You
Like
don't.
strip it down. Like these do. This is where it felt to me like artifacts of AD&D. Siphoned through Sword World, siphoned through Tunnels and Trolls, meshed with the Goblin Slayer franchise. So I kind of wanted that to be stripped back a little bit, because I know that for me it's just a lot to monitor as a GM and as a player too.
Because like, basically, you could, if you never take damage and you just kept fighting, I think it would take more than 20 turns to kill you just from attrition
Yeah,
alone.
yeah.
And so if I were to redesign this and you wanted to keep these elements, I would lower attrition. I would get rid of all of these bubbles and just make them milestones. Actually, this is kind of what we did in Wandering Blades. um, in Wandering Blades, you have HP, but your hit points basically represent narratively your ability to withstand actual serious injury. So like in like the martial arts movies, like like cut me on
Hmm.
the arm and then like you damaged my silk robes or whatnot. Like in D&D, that's just like I take damage. In Wandering Blades, it's like you're taking damage to your hit points. Once your hit points go to 0, you start taking wounds, and that's when shit starts to get dangerous. And in our game, every 5 wounds, you basically get a condition of the GM's choice, whatever makes sense narratively. And at 15, you die.
You see that in a lot of OSR games. I feel like I'm thinking of like doesn't Karn or Cairn, however you
Rune
pronounce it,
Cairn
have
has
that
that.
too, where like you go to 0 HP and then it starts doing damage to your base stats, and when your base stats go down, then you die. Like I do like stuff like that.
Again, it
Um,
has to match what is expected of the fiction that you're telling on the table, right?
yeah,
In Goblin Slayer, it is this weird meta high fantasy world. So it needs to feel both dangerous and it has to also be this power fantasy at the same time, because the Goblin Slayer is like he'll fuck up a whole bunch of goblins, or like Priestess, she has some dope abilities, um or like the high elf archer like I think she's just
hmm
called high elf.
just call it
uh
High Elf. Yeah, High Elf Archer.
and she
Who's
she has
who's
this ability in one of the scenes where she takes out 2 goblins at once with like she curves the arrow.
who's your favorite character, by the way?
Oh, I really like I really like the I'll use the terms from Goblin Slayer. I like the lizard man
Oh, I love the
shaman.
Lizard Man. He's so good. Lizard. I think he's lizard. Is Lizard Man Shaman or Lizard Priest? I think it's
I think
Lizard
it's called
Priest.
Lizard Priest, but I think within the game
Within the
he is
game,
a
he might
lizard
be a
man
shaman. Yeah.
dragon priest. I think that's his
Yeah,
class.
he's the Lizard Man Dragon Priest. He's got some like monk stuff to him as well, but I don't
They've
know if
definitely
he's.
multi-classed.
Yeah,
But like
definitely
he
multi-class,
summons
but
shit.
yeah, he
And I like
summons
him because I like
bone
how
tooth warriors. Yeah, he's so good. He's addicted to cheese
he
too,
loves
which is funny.
cheese. That's the thing I like
Yeah,
about him. I'm like, oh, he's very much a D&D character.
yeah, I like him. He's probably my favorite character. I like the Asian dwarf too. Um,
Hmm.
and I mean, I actually like all of the main characters of the party, which is something I didn't expect to feel after the course of reading it. But definitely the lizard dude. Big fan of the lizard dude.
I like him. I like I think he's funny. I think he definitely lightens things up. I think it's also interesting because there's one point in, I mean, they're constantly doing this, but they're asking like, how many spells do you have left? Like, I only have
Yes,
3 spells left. And it's like,
yes, they've
and
got
that's
their
the
spell
conversation you're having,
slots.
like, oh, I'm
Yes,
almost out of spell slots.
yes. One thing I did like going back to the game is actually this is more of a flavor thing,
Okay.
but I was so I was reading through the book and I was a bit disappointed in skills, like their version of
Mm.
like feats, I guess, because they're a bit boring. All they do is grant +1, +2, +3, up to +5 bonuses on things. So that was kind of whatever to me. But then I got to spells, and the spells are fun. I like the spells. And what I especially liked is how they have in every spell stat block, they have like the chant that the characters actually have
Yes.
to say to unleash the spell. So, for example, one of them I'm looking right now. Um,
Which one are you
on
looking at?
page 324, this is a chant of the Lizardman Priest where he unleashes his Sword Claw spell, and it says, "O sickle wings of Velociraptor, rip and tear, fly and hunt." And that's just really cool to me. I love that bit of flavor in there where a player who wants to echo these spells would actually have some idea of what to say for like the verbal and somatic components of a spell, which, in D&D, nobody really knows unless they're very creative what to do, how to role play that. Here they give it to you. The
And that's
sword
not just
claws.
for, they took that from Sword World. So that's
Oh, I
actually
took
in
that from
Sword
Sword World.
World.
Okay. Well, then
Um,
that's a great part of Sword World that I'm glad they maintained.
it's very cool and it's very on theme here because for the magic system like behind Goblin Slayer, there are very specific types of magic. So
Yes.
they have sorcerer, priest, dragon priest, and shaman, and each one has like a specific magic system that they adhere to, and you can basically multi-class into all of them except for priest and dragon priest. You can't multi-class into you can't have both of those classes because their magic systems essentially are
Incompatible.
incompatible. But yeah, in in Sword World, when you want to do an attack or a spell, there's always a word that you have to say. So if I remember correctly, in Sword World, if you have a gun and you roll attack, you have to say bang.
Isn't it like are the words like always in English in order to like maintain the like oh it sounds cool it's in a foreign language sort
Oh
of
yeah,
thing?
they're all in English,
Um,
and it's exactly like a JRPG. When you pick a character and they're
yeah,
like, "This is my attack," and they go and do it.
that seems to be the tradition of a lot of Japanese TRPGs to have. I mean, I guess in an English RPG, if we could have like a phrase in Latin, like like how the
Yeah,
Final Fantasy games do. But I've noticed that like the Pathfinder Japanese translation, it just translates all of the names of spells. I think in katakana, you know. Because it sounds cool. It
sounds
sounds
cool.
more
It sounds
magic-y
foreign.
that way, and it sounds foreign. You are saying like magiku misairu, like instead of just
Yeah.
whatever the Japanese equivalent is. So
And they put a lot of thought into it too. Like the chants behind each spell are very on theme with
yeah,
what they're
especially for like
supposed to be.
the priest classes, there's different chants depending on what your god is. Like the Valkyrie chants are obviously different from the chants of like the Earth Mother or the Supreme God or the Trade God. For spells that are shared between all the gods, they have different chants for every deity, and I like that. I think that is good flavor.
I'll point out one thing apart from magic, and because I know a lot of people are going to be like, "Oh, wow, the new fifth edition D&D stuff is so like new and different." You know how in the new Unearthed Arcana stuff, they're kind of talking about weapon mastery and how
Hmm.
if you have weapon mastery, you get additional effects with the weapons.
Yeah.
Um, in Sword World and in Goblin Slayer, they've actually already had that. So if you look at any weapon, each conventional weapon has an additional effect, and some effects can only be used if you have certain skills. So,
Mm.
for instance, the short spear has an effect that's pierce +1, but you cannot use pierce unless you have the skill piercing
Yeah.
blow.
I like the weapon stat blocks a lot too. I like the effects. I like the descriptions. I like how they have like the freaking Castlevania vampire killer whip in here for some reason. There seem to be a
Yep,
few
yep.
in-joke. There's like a few in-joke weapons in here as well that I really like. Um,
It's
but
what you would expect.
yeah,
They've got
it's
weapons
cute.
from like different cultures. There are like a whole bunch of like South Asian weapons as well. Um,
Well, because at one point you haven't gotten there in the manga yet. At one point,
like the eastern
Goblin
part of the
Slayer.
world.
No, though there is, well, in Daikatana, the main character is a samurai,
Yeah.
but Goblin Slayer does get like a knife from like it's like a chakram basically, like it's a Southeast Asian style knife, and he's like, "What is
Cool.
this?" And like the dwarven weapons seller who gives it to him be like, "Oh, it's a knife from this part of the world. It always returns to you." And immediately Goblin Slayer starts thinking about how he can use it to kill goblins. It's actually a very cool scene. It's a serrated chakram that looks really cool, and he uses it as you would expect in the chapter in a very creative way.
Like I'll say this, I would definitely love to try this game. Mostly because like I was like, "Oh, I like to build characters." I mean, like
Yeah.
you know this about me. Like in our Pathfinder game when I was like making Tapio and I'm like, "Oh, do
hmm
this and then this and then this." Like Goblin Slayer lets you get that sort of character build craft, but with an accessible
What
system.
classes are you interested in?
Ooh, see, the thing is, I would multi-class.
Yeah, I would
I
multi-class too. I mean, I'd probably be some kind of lizardman or something like that, and I'd probably
Yeah,
go into the shaman, maybe. I don't know, maybe shaman arena, but probably have some sort of fighter stuff as well. I think.
I'd
I'm not sure.
probably. I think what I would do is I would have some summoning magic mixed with like fighter, ranger, and scout. Like I think I'd want my character to be a ranged attacker, but be able to summon like hirelings to basically protect me. And you could
So
do that
Dragon
in
Two's
this,
warriors, yeah, you can do that. Yeah.
which is super cool. Now, that said, we've talked a lot about what we liked. What didn't we like mechanically about Goblin Slayer?
I think for me, broadly speaking, I would like to play this. I would like to be a player of this game. I probably wouldn't run it, just because to me there's a little bit too much crunch in areas that I'm slowly moving away from in my preferences. Stuff like having to keep track of all those conditions and bits and bobs like attrition. I kind of just don't really have time for anymore. Stuff like looking up at a table that reminds me of THACO. Like I just
Mm-hmm.
that to me, I don't want to say antiquated game design because it's just different, but that to me, it feels a bit laborious. Whereas um, I think a lot of RPGs that I enjoy now are moving in the opposite direction, streamlining a lot of that stuff. When you bring in the crunch, it's um, it's crunch oriented towards specific abilities instead of just stuff that forces you to consult charts or look at graph that made me think of trigonometry. That's like a general complaint that I have for the book as a whole.
It's very valid. I think if you're going to pick up Goblin Slayer and you're going to run the adventures, you'd probably just want to run the adventures as they're written. Like I would use the read aloud text and I would literally go in order.
Yeah, exactly.
And like that's not
I
my
don't think.
style.
Yeah, I don't think I could like spin a whole campaign off of this. Like the two adventures in the book are actually pretty decent. I like them. There's one where you got to save a baby from
Yep.
goblins, and one where you got to fight a bunch of lynxes, and they're actually really cute. Like I like the little maps that they have there, and they're nicely done. But I don't know if I could easily homebrew something with this system.
Well, you know what you could do is I was thinking about this because I was like, I don't think I would play this, but there are elements of it that I think are interesting. What I would do is, if you wanted to do a campaign for Goblin Slayer, you could take the Red Hand of Doom, the 3.5
Yeah,
adventure,
I mean,
and just
there's
make that
there's
Goblin Slayer.
yeah, there's actually a lot of systems I would probably use before this if I wanted to do Goblin Slayer. I mean, you could do, the thing is Goblin Slayer is generic and it's meta by on purpose. You could
Hmm.
really use any fantasy system, but yes, like you said, the Red Hand of Doom, perfect for like a Goblin Slayer
It's the first
sort of
major
thing.
arc
Yeah,
actually.
first
Like when
major
they're
arc.
defending the farm, that's kind of like Red Hand of Doom, but at a smaller scale. I'd
Yeah.
honestly just play fourth edition D&D.
Fourth edition would be fine for something like this. Um, I mean, yeah, you could do any edition of D&D, honestly. Any edition of Pathfinder, both would be fine. But yeah, fourth edition would be good. I mean, but honestly, like after having played Fabula Ultima, like that is probably the one thing I would use for any anime or JRPG inspired game at this
Oh,
point. Because Fabula Ultima is very, very good, and you could use it for dark fantasy, you could use it for light fantasy, you could use it for high fantasy, and I feel like it would work for this.
what is it that you
Um,
like about Fabula Ultima?
Fabula Ultima, it does a lot of what this game does, in that it has interesting character classes, encourages you to multi-class, but it also encourages, it also just gives the players a lot of power over the narrative in the same way that the fate points do. So Fabula Ultima has Fabula points. And
Mm.
what you can do with Fabula points is that you can spend a Fabula point at any time to inject something into the narrative that the group, if agreed upon, now classifies as canon in the narrative.
I like that.
And this could be, it could obviously be dangerous in the wrong hands, but in the game that we're planning, that I'm playing right now, we've used that to make people's backstories tie together, to give my character something in common with the with the villain of the scene who ended up having killed my character's uncle. There's a lot of cool narrative stuff that Fabula points are used for, and that combines with the cool mechanical stuff that contains your frontline and backline combat in a similar way to what Goblin Slayer has. Because this game was influenced by like Sword World and
Yeah.
Ryutama, it has classes that resemble the front line and the back line, but somehow, because it's more of a modern design game, it somehow manages to make everyone feel effective while streamlining and eliminating some of the needless crunch. Like there are classes that have no combat abilities per se, like the Lore Master, where it's just you know a lot about monsters, but nothing feels like a wasted turn in combat. And I mean, I don't know. I think everybody needs to check out Fabula Ultima. You know,
If
These
only it
Italians
was
get a
an
pass.
Asian game.
These Italians get a pass, in my opinion. Like this is,
Do they get a pass to the point where we would do an episode on it?
well, the dude who wrote this was hanging out in the Asians Represent server back in the day, and talking to people and learning things. So I don't know. They
Oh, I
had
get
some
it, that, I guess it gets passed then.
they had some Asian people. There's some Asian people acknowledged in the credits. I don't know, man. Italians they know their anime, so that's all I can say. It's really good, and it was inspired specifically by Ryutama. And by, I mean, I think Sword World is in there a little bit as
Okay,
well.
I mean, it's been on my list of games to buy, and I just haven't been able to
Okay, here you
prioritize
go.
it.
The biggest influences are, you're going to like this, the 13th Age.
Oh my god, there's a
Animo,
Kickstarter I think for 13H.
yeah, it's the second edition. Ryutama.
Mhm.
So it was actually written and produced with permission from the authors of Ryutama, which is nice.
Oh, cool.
Apocalypse World, Anima Prime, Blades in the
Whoa.
Dark. It's got clocks in there. D&D 4th edition. Um, Tenra Basho Zero, which is also
Wow,
a
that's a
Japanese
Japanese game.
TRPG. Yeah, and Fate. So there's a lot of bits and pieces in there. So
Interesting.
yeah, Fabula Ultima is currently one of my favorite games, I have to say, after having played a couple sessions of it.
That is
So
quite the endorsement.
yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe like the creator is actually problematic and it's all going to
Oh,
fall
please
apart.
no.
But I hope not, because from now on, I think if I ever wanted to run a game set in some anime or JRPG inspired world, I'm probably just going to turn towards Fabula Ultima.
And if you don't want combat, Mapamundi. Right
Yeah,
there.
and Mapamundi, which also has, we also have a fate point mechanic as well, but it's different because it's not combat based. However, I do think we're moving in the direction of use a fate point to manipulate the fiction in an interesting way, where the power is in the hands of the players. Like that is also very Mapamundi inspired, and Goblin Slayer the TRPG has that a little bit, but is still
Mhm.
kind of beholden to some of these sacred cows of the D&D, Sword World, Tunnels and Trolls, RuneQuest
Yeah,
world, I think.
it's an old school RPG
It's an
in
old school
spirit.
RPG. It's an old school RPG, and I mean, I don't think you would run it, right, Daniel? Probably not.
I
You said
wouldn't
you,
run it for the
yeah,
exact same reasons you wouldn't run it,
yeah.
because It's very prescriptive. It also requires every single player to have a copy of the book
Yeah.
because you have to go and you have to reference all of your different skills and stuff. I think it plays slowly, but I would still recommend it to people who are interested in learning more about tabletop RPGs. I would recommend it to people who are fans of Goblin Slayer, obviously, and I would also recommend it to folks who are curious about design sensibilities in other parts of the world.
I think
Because
those are the reasons to check it out. Absolutely.
the Japanese design, now that I've read, Goblin Slayer and I've read Sword World, like I have like a baseline now. And when I compare it to Japanese indie tabletop RPGs like Floria, which is the one I'm currently prepping an
Hmm.
episode on now, I'm like, they're like totally different.
Yeah.
But if you want like rules heavy but not tactical, and you don't want to actually have to think a lot about what you're supposed to do, Sword World and Goblin Slayer are perfect because there is literally a check and a rule for everything. Um, and if you like, like Final Fantasy Tactics, or you like Tales of Symphonia, if you like, uh, what was that, Yuden Chronicles, like the
Oh,
Suikoden
yes.
games,
Suikoden, yeah.
all of those things, you'll find that in Sword World and Goblin Slayer
Also,
for sure.
also listed as inspirational works in the back of Fabula
Fabula
Ultima.
Ultima.
Suikoden, the Tale series.
I
Shin Megami
love the Tale
Tensei,
series.
Radiant Historia, Octopath Traveler, Final Fantasy, Etrian Odyssey, everything.
Of course,
Um,
of course. I actually just got Tactics Ogre
oh,
reborn on the
nice.
Switch.
Oh,
My
fantastic,
my
fantastic.
mom was walking and found a stack of old Xbox 360 games on the street and like gave them to me, and I was like, "Oh, these are all shitty games." And I went to the game store and I was like, "Can I get store credit for these?" And they were like, $40, and I was like, "Cool, I'll take Tactics Ogre for the Switch."
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, but anyways, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily run it, but I don't think that makes this a bad game.
Yeah,
The
I feel the same way.
I think that there are things about Goblin Slayer that will definitely turn people away from playing this game. If you don't like, if you're not used to bioessentialism in your tabletop RPGs, you're not gonna like Goblin Slayer. You're also not gonna like Sword World, because Goblin Slayer tells you if you're a human, these are your base stats. If you're an elf, a dwarf, a lizard man, a Rhea, these are your base stats. I think Sword World is a lot more prescriptive with its bioessentialism, um, but Goblin Slayer still has that, and I know people aren't going to like that. Um,
The description of humans in the text in the book is actually quite funny because they shit on humans a lot.
oh yeah,
They say humans are weak, foolish, and all around terrible. They're frailer than dwarves, dumber than elves, less skilled than lizardmen, and duller than Rias. They're arrogant, greedy, and frequently quarrel amongst themselves. For all their restlessness, they are clumsy. In essence, they all drag one another down.
it's
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 pretty
it's
funny.
super meta. It's super
Yeah.
meta. Another reason why I think a lot of people wouldn't play this game is of course the darker themes of Goblin Slayer, right? If you're gonna play this game, you're probably gonna play it because you're curious about the world of Goblin Slayer. And if you haven't read the light novels, watched the anime, read the manga, and you aren't it's expecting those themes, I
Yeah.
guarantee you're immediately not gonna want to play this game.
So here's my thing, and kind of my main take is actually, in my opinion, this game actually probably doesn't need to exist
I was gonna say
because
that there is
because
no place
there's
for this
there's
game.
no reason for it to exist. Goblin Slayer, it's not really a world I want to play in, and actually that's true for me when it comes to a lot of licensed TTRPGs. There are very few licensed TTRPGs that I actually care to play in, with the exception of maybe like the One Ring and Call of Cthulhu.
Mm.
Like I generally just don't really care that much about playing in the world of like Star Wars or Dune or Marvel superheroes. Though that one I'm kind of on the fence about. But particularly with Goblin Slayer, because Goblin Slayer's strength, despite the flaws it has as a franchise, its strength is providing meta stories about a D&D game with characters that if you play D&D or a similar fantasy tabletop game, you're going to recognize and you're going to appreciate. It doesn't need to be its own TTRPG. It should be taken as a statement on TTRPGs, I think.
Completely agree. There is even a piece of art in one of the early chapters where they actually show the gods playing the world, and there are d20s
Yes.
on their table.
So
They're
I
literally
will.
D20s, character
I love
sheets.
I love that shit. Actually, that like
Or
made me
like, oh,
weirdly.
I'm an adventurer. You need to register. Here's your character
Yeah.
sheet.
The whole thing with the gods playing D20s and like laughing at their little minis on the table, I ate that stuff up. I got like weirdly emotional. I was like, oh my god, it's so meta. Like the players are the gods. Like look, they're laughing at a little Goblin Slayer mini. Like I love that stuff, and it's because I run a lot of games. And I think if you
Mhm.
run a lot of games and are able to tolerate, dark fantasy tropes, you might like Goblin Slayer. Um, but I think you might also feel like this doesn't really need to be its own game. It works best as a statement on the games that inspired it. And that,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
that's
also
that's
because
my
the
take.
story of Goblin Slayer is not necessarily about the world, it's about the
No,
characters
it's
and the
about the
relationship with the
characters.
gods. And
I mean, the story has a lot
yeah.
of slice of life moments where it's kind of just the characters talking about, hey, I got no spells left.
Hmm.
What do we do now? Or hey, I'm fatigued. Or like, hey, we're going to go on an adventure. Oh, this like it's a bunch of it's a campaign run by a GM that kind of just strings a bunch of little micro adventures together, and the characters spend a lot of time shooting shit in the tavern in between.
Like a TTRPG, Goblin Slayer has the tonal whiplash of a
Yeah,
D&D game. It's like on one
absolutely.
moment it's like extremely graphic and super edgy, and then the next moment it's like, I need everyone's help to defend this farm against goblins. I'll give you whatever you want. To
Yes,
like, oh, give me a roll of cheese, a wheel of cheese. Um,
yes.
yeah, you're gonna
I
get
think
that.
that's what it is.
But yeah, this is not a game that needs to exist. It is 100% one of those things where they, and I don't know if they've done this, they haven't done it in English, where they could have published a world guide to the world
Hmm.
of Goblin Slayer, and you could have taken any other game and played within that. Because there's an incredible world guide for the world of Berserk,
Hmm.
and it actually has all of the like the history of the world, all the characters, and all the different factions and stuff. They did the same for Delicious in Dungeon, which is
Hmm.
actually, I think, an anime franchise that would make a good tabletop RPG
Yeah, I think
because
so too.
you could make a Ryutama style game with maybe some combat where you're going out and collecting ingredients and cooking, and your adventure is trying to make a meal of this caliber.
I will say this is sort of unrelated, but I do like how just in anime and manga in general now there are a lot of really cool fantasy series that are definitely inspired by tabletop games that are just prevalent in the discourse now. Like Delicious
Free
in
Ren,
Dungeon, obviously, Free Ren. I put Goblin Slayer up there too, even though
yeah.
Goblin Slayer has its detractors. There's the isekai genre brought in a lot of stuff that probably was not that great, but there's a lot of big fantasy series out now that are very good, and I feel like, when I was in high school obsessed with anime, all we had was like Lodoss War and
Sword World.
Slayers. Yeah, and we didn't have as much, and so there's a lot more now, and I really like seeing that. Um,
Yeah.
just in general, just general observation.
Yeah, and I think most of these though would not make good. The modern ones wouldn't make a good tabletop RPG. Free Ren, I think, would. There is no need for a free Ren tabletop RPG because
Yeah,
that is
it
just
doesn't fit.
Ryutama,
It doesn't really fit with the themes necessarily
100%.
of the series. But I think
It,
Delicious in Dungeon has stuff in there that could work because it's
I
got
think
that
it would
unique
make a
cooking
better board
mechanic.
game, and there is a board game. There's an
That's true.
adventure
Board
card
game.
game that came out in
Yeah.
Japan. It looks very cute. Like Berserk does not need to be a tabletop RPG. It is an interesting
No.
setting. It's a great story. It's very dark. Goblin Slayer, same sort of thing. I
Hmm.
think if you were to make a tabletop RPG out of a fantasy anime, you could maybe do Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash,
Mm.
because it's an isekai, but it's really dark. You could make it dark like an OSR game where people die. Um, you could do the same for like Sword Art Online. um,
Yeah.
Obviously, things like Mobile Suit Gundam and stuff you could totally do. But from the fantasy side, I think most of these stories are very character driven and not world driven. And so when you try to make a game about Goblin Slayer, but you omit having the Goblin Slayer in the game, are you actually playing Goblin Slayer?
Yeah. And that was a big omission that peeved me a little bit. Um,
Yeah, it just
if
doesn't
they
need to
if
exist.
yeah, I think as we said before, you could run Goblin Slayer in many other systems, OSR, mainstream, Fabula Ultima. But I am happy that we read this book. I enjoyed reading it.
Me
And I
too.
think, for someone like me who has read all the Goblin Slayer manga, it was a fun way to like cap off having finished the last chapter of the manga fairly recently. And so I definitely recommend it to fans of the franchise. And as Daniel said, anyone who just wants to understand Japanese design sensibilities and who wants to get a taste of Sword World. And for that reason, it's important, I think.
Absolutely. And look, I'm glad we're kind of doing content like this too. Like I love the fact that you and I were like, yeah, you know what, we're gonna take this on, we're gonna read it completely in a vacuum, separate of one another, and then we're gonna talk
Hmm.
about it. And we should do more of this. And folks, if you are interested in us reading games and talking about them, let us know which ones. Like I know that after this, I'm probably gonna have to go buy myself a copy of Fabula Ultima because Jeremy, I like. Look,
I
I any game that you like, I guarantee that I will like because
It's
we have
fun, man.
very
I'm
similar
I'm in
tastes.
I'm in a game with Issa and her partner Nat and some other folks, and it's been good, man. Dude, I'm playing like kind of a Tapio adjacent character.
Hell yeah!
I'm like Edward Elric if he were a slightly more annoying 14-year-old boy. But I've also lost my arm because of an attack on my village, and I've recreated my arm with Magitech, and I've got a gun that is powered with hopes and dreams, and I can heal people by shooting, like throwing a healing potion in the air, shooting it, and letting the healing rain pour down on everyone, and it's good, man. It's fun.
You're like a kinder Tapio. That's awesome.
Yeah, and like Issa's a dragoon. Issa is like female Kane from Final Fantasy IV, like doing dragoon stuff,
Oh
jumping
hell
off in
yeah!
the air, and we're gonna. I'm like a tinkerer class. You can start projects, and so one of
Mm.
my projects is to build a sky cycle for us. So like it could be like basically a pod racer, so that we can fly together, and she can jump off the back and lance people while I'm piloting it and shooting it
Yo, that's
from
dope.
the front. So
Actually, another
good
game
game.
I would recommend if folks are interested in JRPGs is Cloudbreaker Alliance.
Yeah,
Um,
Cloudbreaker is pretty good.
and like full disclosure, I worked on Cloudbreaker. But I think Cloudbreaker is a good modern indie RPG take on the structure of a JRPG, especially with how combat works and everything. It wears its inspirations like very openly. So yeah, I would recommend that one too. But that said, if you folks are looking to try out Goblin Slayer, if you're looking to try out Sword World, Fabula Ultima, Cloudbreaker, Mappa Mundi, you're gonna need some dice. And so if you're looking for a flashy new set of dice, look no further than Dice Envy. If you head to diceenvy.com/AZNSrepresent and use the code AZNSrepresent, you get 10% off your order. And of course, if you want to listen to ad-free versions of Jeremy and I uh, talking about JRPGs and Asian TTRPG design, you're gonna have to head to patreon.com/AZNSrepresent. Shout out to our most honorable patrons: Metalweave Games, Valorous Games, Michelle, Stefan, most honorable times to Epic Impulse. We really appreciate your support. And thank you to everyone listening or watching this episode of the podcast. We appreciate it. We've been doing this for a really long time, and I feel like every time I get together with the crew, whether it's you, Jeremy, or anyone else, I feel like inspired to play more games and read more games and work
Indeed,
harder on my own stuff. Um,
indeed.
but that said, we'll see you folks next time on the Asians Represent podcast.